I wanted to start a little bit more general than the group Muslimish. So I wanted to start by just talking about how we probably all faced some very difficult times that really test the limits of what we can bear. And while we might want to desperately move on, we forget, sort of especially in the heat of suffering, how important those difficult times are in helping us become who we are. And so it's really suffering that really helps to transform us into sort of new beings. And so I want to start here fairly broadly by talking about this connection between how we can look at difficult times in sort of a positive light as opportunities for growth. And through this growth, we then become more resilient to future hardships. And with this view, resilience is not innate, so it's not something we're born with, but it's something that we develop through our experiences. And so, although I won't be talking about this that much through the talk, but I think it underlies a lot of what I'll say about the group Muslimish, where we're connecting this idea of dealing with difficulties with helping us grow. And I'll be focusing on one particular difficulty that a lot of people in the group Muslimish face, and that's one of having the freedom to define who you are or to define your own identity. And the stakes, I think, can be pretty high, especially among many members of the group who are either questioning Muslims, they've left the faith, or are leaving the faith. And so you may become ostracized from family or friends. You may even have some people in the group have had death threats or have had to leave their countries for being, say, coming out as atheists, simply by saying something that might be deemed blasphemous. And so one of the aims of Muslimish is to provide support to those who are questioning the religion, who are leaving the religion, who have already left the religion, and to give people an atmosphere and community that can help them grow. And the community can facilitate and support the process of growth, especially during these very difficult times that you might experience. And so in talking to different members of the group before giving this talk, I was like, well, what do you think, how the group has changed you or might have made you more resilient? And one thing that I was hearing was that for people, it made them feel more bold and less afraid to sort of speak their mind and to even say things that might have been considered blasphemous from their past. And that's because you knew that there was this entire community sort of behind you that sort of shared your views, that would support you, and could then help you. In fact, some people say the group, in fact, helps them be more blasphemous and sort of help define their identity even more. And so what I'll talk about today then is I'll give you a sense of the group Muslimish. So mostly our group is in New York City, but we also have chapters in Detroit, which is in Dearborn, which is where almost all of the Arabs in like the U.S. are there, also in Toronto and Atlanta. And so I'll describe first our mission statement, and then I wanted to give, because I think for some people, if you're not of a Muslim background, it's hard to sort of understand how Muslimish might be sort of unique or different relative to coming from a Christian or a Jewish background. And so I wanted to historically contextualize the group. And then I wanted to give two topics that I think would give a flavor for what the group is interested in. And finally, I wanted to give a more personal story of me trying to adapt a ritual Muslim prayer to be more personally meaningful to me. So the mission statement has 3 points. The first is to create a safe, supportive, and open-minded environment for the exchange of thoughts and ideas among current and former Muslims. And one of the big ideas of the group is to try to normalize dissent, which Kathy was talking about earlier, and to make it okay to question. In fact, the idea of questioning is so important that if you look at our logo, it has a question mark, and it's an upside-down crescent. And the crescent is an important Islamic symbol. So questioning is really at the core of the group. And one of the hopes is that in questioning and in talking with each other, we might be able to also equip ourselves with compassionate sort of forms of communication that we can then take to our communities outside Muslimish. And one thing that I think is unique about our group there's other groups that also deal with people leaving the faith. And the one thing that's different about Muslimish is this interest in maintaining dialogue between people who are ex-Muslim and Muslim. And so there's a lot of care that's also done sometimes to not be, if you're around people who have left the religion, there might be a lot of anger and hate, and it gets directed at the religion. So often if you're at our meetings, that happens, but often there'll be people who will say, well, we can't characterize it in that way, and take a more nuanced view. And so along the same lines of trying to have dialogue between different groups, we're interested in fostering a pluralist society that respects the rights of all individuals to live according to their conscience. And a more sort of long-term goal is to abolish blasphemy and apostasy laws around the globe. So our group's mainly in the US and Canada, and so we have the freedom to question the religion. But if you come from any Muslim countries, those same freedoms don't exist. And in fact, there are laws that would indicate like the death penalty if you are blasphemous or apostate. So one of the interests is bringing this atmosphere of questioning back to our home countries. So now to give you a sense of, to contextualize Muslimish, I wanted to take, I think, the history into context and how coming from a Muslim background, there's some differences you might face than if we had come from a Christian or Jewish background. I think one of the big ones is that Islam never had a Reformation. So Christianity has an era that's called the Reformation. In Judaism, I think in the 19th century, they had a period of Reformation. So Islam never really experienced that. And it also never really had the Enlightenment. The ideas of the Enlightenment, like science and rationality, never really took root in Islam. If you're interested, there's like lots of books, but these are two of the ones here are my personal favorites. One is called Destiny Disrupted. This guy is a world history. He wrote world history textbooks, and he was dissatisfied with the books. So he basically wrote this book as if the Muslims controlled the world and were in power, and how would they write a history book? And so that's an interesting one. And then the Islamic Enlightenment is one that's very interesting, and it shows that the ideas of the Enlightenment were brought over by Muslims to Muslim countries, but for various reasons, they sort of never took root. There were various problems that occurred. And then the one thing I want to note is by saying there's no Reformation, I don't mean to say that in Islam there's no reform-minded people, there's no people modernizing the religion or integrating science and reason. It's just on a large scale, it doesn't exist. So if you're interested, there's this one book called Islam's Quantum Question, and this guide deals with trying to reconcile Muslim tradition with modern science. So there are these movements towards reform, but what I'm saying is on a large scale, it doesn't exist like in Christianity and Judaism. I could talk about for a while why there is no reform, but I can quickly say like one of the reasons are that traditionally the Western powers have supported more conservative Muslim groups. Also, there's been this equating, I think, for many Muslims of ideas related to the Enlightenment, like science and reason, with Western imperialism. And so there's been a rejection of ideas that might be related to science and reason into the religion. And part of that relates to these, I think, threats that many Muslims feel, both in America and I think abroad, to their identity. They feel like it's being taken away by this modern world. And I think one example of how this threat is experienced is with the hijab. And so this is a picture from the 1960s in Cairo. And so you can see these three women aren't wearing the hijab. Actually, it would be hard for you to tell that they're not even from Europe or something. And so in most of the Muslim world, actually from the 1960s and before, the hijab wasn't a big thing. Actually, it was people didn't wear it. People didn't even really know about it. And so since the 1960s onwards, the hijab has become a much bigger icon in the Muslim world. And so what I'm arguing for here is that the hijab is an example then of something. The importance of the hijab is really as a Muslim identity symbol, that this defines who we are. And it's become that needing to define the Muslim identity as being distinct from the Western world has become, I think, even stronger in sort of modern times. And so the consequence of all this is what I had described before, that there's no large-scale reform-type movement in Islam as there has been in Christianity and Judaism. And I think there's also a lack of equivalent scholarly work, especially from Muslim countries. So when I was in college, people often talked about like the historicity of Jesus. I mean, there's some books here that talk a lot about putting Judaism and Christianity in context of history. There's even archaeological digs that are done in Israel to try to understand the historical context. So these things are not concepts in the Muslim world. You wouldn't really, it's not part of the tradition to question or try to understand the faith in terms of history. And so I think this lack of religious diversity that I'm terming here and scholarly work, I think has important implications for the group Muslimish that are different than if you come from a Christian or Jewish background. So one of them is it makes a group with secular humanist Muslims or atheist Muslims or questioning Muslims to be very novel and very blasphemous. And I think it also heightens the tensions that we might experience in trying to have dialogue with the larger Muslim community. Because I mentioned there's no real reform type movement, or it's not at a large scale. So there's this bigger chasm between sort of Muslimish group and the larger sort of Muslim community. And maybe this is a good thing, though, that because of this lack of diversity in scholarly work, Muslimish as a group has a lot more space to cover. So a lot of our talks you might see actually engage in scholarly work that you wouldn't normally find in trying to understand the religion. And also, we cover a broader range of people, ex-Muslims to Muslims. And so then I guess the nice thing about that is it increases dialogue and increases our connection to what we're doing. So I wanted to now give you a sense of some of the topics we might be interested in the group and topics that we'd like to spread to the larger Muslim community. And that deals with secular values in Islam and humanist values in Islam, which I guess would be very topical here. And so these are two people that I've shown here, Wissam Sharafuddin, who's given a talk at a Detroit conference, which we actually had at the Secular Humanist Temple for Judaism in Detroit. And so he has a talk about this. And Jinan Rauf also has talked a lot, actually, about humanism in Islam. She actually recently gave a talk at the Humanist Hub in Cambridge, where she talked about humanism, Islam, and feminism. Was sort of her topic. It's a very interesting talk. And you can see these talks on our YouTube channel, on the Muslimish YouTube channel. So now, one idea that Wissam and others have discussed is how there's no scriptural tradition for governance in Islam. And they've used that idea to say that...
I'm just trying to process the thought.
So, and the idea that there's no scriptural tradition is trying to imply that secular governments can exist in the Muslim world. So, for instance, if you look in the Quran or the Hadith, there's no explicit delineation for exactly how a government should be made. And it's interesting, if you look, say, now, you might be like, well, look, if you look in Muslim countries now, like Saudi Arabia or Iran, they seem to operate more like theocracies. But actually, the interesting thing about both those countries is the philosophy behind those governments and behind the religions in those governments are actually from the 19th and 20th century. So they're very recent developments that have been made. And if you really want evidence for the lack of scriptural tradition for governance, you can look at the moment that the Prophet Muhammad died. So after his death, there was no clear line of succession, and there was various factions that were sort of vying for power. And if you look over time, what happened is people improvised. So they figured out how a Muslim government should be made over time. So one example of this that I like is a story from Umar ibn Khattab, who's the second caliph or ruler of Islam. And he formed a shura that upon his deathbed, so shura ended up being this committee of 6 people that he chose, and those 6 people were to decide who the next caliph was. So it wasn't a hereditary thing early on. And what's interesting, I guess, about those 6 people is that it was almost like a primitive form of representational government. So the 6 people were chosen to represent the population, and those 6 people needed to make their decision about who the next caliph should be based on what the population would want. So the point here that I'm making is that the argument here then is that without the strong scriptural tradition for governance and the fact that over time Muslim governments sort of made up what was needed for their governments based on the needs of the people, this would imply that Muslims can also then shape their governments according to their needs and support secular values in Islam. The second point that's sort of big in our group is humanist values. And so if you come from a Muslim background, humanist values run counter to the tradition, and the tradition states that there's this privileged moment in time. And that moment in time for Muslims is when the Prophet Muhammad was alive and when the Quran was being revealed. So if you want knowledge or insights, you always need to go back to this privileged moment to gain additional knowledge. And so this would run, of course, in contrast to the other view that history is made by human beings. Right? And we act as historical agents that determine and generate knowledge. And so in that case, you don't need actually this privileged moment to figure out what God meant. Instead, we can use each moment to sort of reevaluate and reinvestigate how history occurred and how history sort of occurred relative to us. And so for me, the interesting thing about these humanist perspective in being part of Muslimish was in terms of the stories that I was raised with. So a lot of the stories of the early Muslims, of Prophet Muhammad, and sort of being part of the group. So normally when you grow up, often these stories, I almost feel like they're photoshopped. They're like Photoshop stories that are put on a slab, and you're told, and it's a one direction. You're told about them, and you internalize them. And to me, that seems very unexciting. And so being part of Muslimish, it's been very exciting to look back at these stories, but more as like these were regular humans dealing with everyday situations, and somehow they got past it, and they did sort of these amazing things. I actually sometimes feel like, I actually think a lot of these stories would be awesome to tell the rest of the world, and I often find the stories remind me a lot of Game of Thrones. So in the early Muslim world, if you watch Game of Thrones, it's actually a lot like that. There's these different people, different personalities vying for power, and because there's a strong oral tradition in Islam, there's a lot of details about the story. So I mentioned that second Caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, he has a lot of stories. He really was very patriarchal and stuff. He was like, in many ways, he had a lot of bad things that happened, but he's revered. So for instance, when he converted to Islam, part of that conversion story includes elements of him beating his sister. So there are these different elements that are in these stories that give a real human element, like that I think are really cool and interesting and make him seem like this real person. So finally, I wanted to end with this idea of us adapting our traditions to ourselves. So like I mentioned, we recently had a conference in Detroit, and so there the Rabbi Jeffrey Flack, I think if I got his name right, talked about how they look to take their Jewish traditions and to remove the theistic elements and maybe remove the ritualistic elements and incorporate it into their own lives. And so with, I guess, that same idea, you'll see me trying to incorporate the Muslim ritual prayer into my own life. If you're interested in this topic about prayer, we had a podcast recently talking about people's different experiences with prayer growing up, and so you can see that at muslimish.org/podcast. So for those of you who are not familiar with Muslim ritual prayer, which is distinct from just general prayer, which we call dua, so the ritual prayer is done 5 times a day. And so if you're a practicing Muslim, that's like quite a big demand on your life to do that. And so you can see how a Muslim then doesn't forget about God, but in particular, they don't forget about their Muslim identity. They're constantly having to pray. It's often done communally. At least when I was growing up, it's encouraged that you go to the mosque and pray with other people. And even if you're not praying with other people, there is this reminder of prayer, which is you orient your prayer towards the Kaaba. So in the top right is a picture of the Kaaba, which is the most holy site in Islam. It's the place where people go for Hajj, for their pilgrimage. And so it's draped in this black cloth or something like that. And inside the Kaaba, there's a black rock that has sort of historical significance. It's supposed to go back. Abraham put that black rock there. And the story goes is that if you touch the black rock, it takes away all your bad deeds as well. And so all Muslims then orient themselves to this Kaaba and to this rock when they pray. And the other important point is that it's all done in Arabic. So even for me, I don't speak Arabic and I don't understand Arabic, but I would still be doing it in Arabic. And so there are very few groups, I think. I don't personally know of anyone, but I've heard there are people who will do it all in English, but that's very rare. And I think just want to make this one point, which is that the prayer is distinct, say, from something like meditation, where you're worshiping the divine. And so in my practice, it's less about worship of the divine and more like something more like mantra meditation. And I think for me, relative to other members of Muslimish, it might be easier because I don't speak Arabic. So that was the one thing I realized, because I don't speak the language and the words don't directly mean anything to me, I can sort of do that prayer as if it's like a mantra. And so I then focus more on my breath, my movements, and my speech. So I'm trying to be more mindful. That's my focus. And I've also adapted aspects to be more meaningful to me. So I've changed the prayer around a little bit. So one thing I did, what I thought was fun was, so normally we orient ourselves to the Kaaba. So I was trying to think of something else I might be able to orient myself to. So to keep the underlying meaning of orienting yourself to something else other than yourself. And so I thought something else that was black would be the black hole at the center of our galaxy. And the black hole, like the Kaaba, has all these people that are like oriented towards it in some way. In the case of the black hole, it's not people. And so if you look on your phone, you can tell the phone, you have apps that will tell you where the black hole is at any given moment in time. And So then you orient yourself, or I would orient myself towards the black hole. When I started, it was nice because you also imagine this black hole and you imagine everything going around it. So it's sort of this connection with the cosmos that you sort of feel. And then I've also substituted some Quranic verses. So when you pray, there's certain parts of the prayer where you repeat back verses from the Quran. And so, because again, like I don't speak Arabic, so it doesn't mean anything to me. So I've tried to replace it with other things that I would memorize. And so I just wanted to come back now. I've talked to you a bit about the group. I wanted to come back now to this point of identity. I recently saw the movie Love, Simon, which is actually about a closeted gay kid. Also deals with this issues of identity. And he talks about how terrifying it is to tell the world who you are. Because what if the world rejects you? And so I think for individuals not yet part of Muslimish, this might be something that resonates with them. They might, in the outside world, and people do feel this way, they feel antagonism with their surrounding community. And so the idea is that Muslimish as a group can then provide a more nurturing environment. So in Muslimish, you can then experiment with different ideas, experiment with your identity, and through sort of dialogue with other people, sort of come to a stronger sense of who you are. And we can then sort of get that stronger sense by developing new ideas, like how to integrate secular ideas and humanist ideas with your Muslim background, which, like I had mentioned through the talk, is sort of a fairly new thing to do. And so then, when you have all that together, that have maybe the stronger identity from being a Muslimish, you can sort of go out into the larger world, and then if the world does reject you, which it will, in the case of being from a Muslim background, you'll know that you have this community behind you to support you and this sort of stronger feeling of who you are. So with that, thank you for all being here and listening.
And could you take questions?
Yeah, of course.
So, questions that you want to... I have thousands. I'm going to let other people...
Yeah, me too.
It's almost like I got to think.
Yeah, so I had to quickly go through a lot of things.
Yeah.
It was really an overview.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
All right, now, I remember when I was in junior high school, I studied about the Baha'i movement in
Yeah.
Iran.
Yes.
Now, that movement supposedly had a kind of a global perspective, and I'm just wondering, did it ever get out of Iran? Did it spread out of Iran?
It's mostly outside Iran.
And is it in many Arab countries? I've also heard that Baha'is are being persecuted now by the Iranian government.
Yeah.
So is it in other Arab countries, and is it interfaith or multi-faith?
So the book I was mentioning, The Islamic Enlightenment, does talk about the Baha'i faith, in part because it is a reform movement, but the Baha'i faith is like not part of Islam. It's not considered. I mean, it has traditions from Islam, but it hasn't like fed back into the religion very much. But the Baha'is actually, though, were persecuted from the beginning, from when they started. But they did, sorry, I'm going to answer a few things. So one thing I was just going to say, they were reform. So one thing the Baha'is did is, so in Islam right now, for instance, if you're a woman, there's a big struggle about leading the prayer. So there are some progressive Muslims who are advocating that women can lead the prayer. But the Baha'is sort of changed a lot of that and made the gender equality. So there were even some Baha'i women who were like spiritual leaders, which was sort of unheard of in the 1800s at the time. So the Baha'is were like very reform-minded, very progressive, as an example I gave with the women being these spiritual leaders. But they eventually had to spread out because from the beginning they were persecuted. And they're still persecuted because they're considered apostates. They're not considered Muslims. But the problem then is that the Baha'is then haven't fed back into the main Muslim faith. It's like its own religion now, I would say.
If I could just add quickly, I can tell you something about modern Baha'i. So there are only 7 Baha'i temples in the world. And so when I lived in Chicago, one of them is in Wilmette, which is right outside of Chicago. It's one of the 7. It was one of the most breathtaking, beautiful things you've ever seen. And what's interesting to me, I have a couple of friends who are Baha'i, and actually someone who in seminary came out of the Baha'i tradition. So I don't know a lot about the history of it, but what's interesting is there's a very small movement, but it's interesting, in Hollywood, of actors who, I don't know if it's like in their familial history, but who are gravitating towards the Baha'i religion. So Andy Grammer is a pop singer. I can't even think of the songs that he's had. You would probably recognize him because they're so popular. He's Baha'i, very devout Baha'i. And if you've ever seen the show Jane the Virgin, it's very popular for a while. The main lead male character, also young guy, also Baha'i. And there's like this group, and it's growing. I'm not sure what it is about it. And I don't know much about the history of it, but it is very, very interesting that there's a younger kind of group that's kind of gravitating for whatever reason behind that. And you'll see, if you ever have a chance to go to the Parliament of World Religions, there are a lot of Baha'is that go there, and you can find out a lot about the religion.
When our son, he was vacillating toward that as well.
Some of the stuff you were talking about got me thinking of the different splits in the Muslim world. From the first couple of generations after Muhammad, there was the Shiite-Sunni split, right? And I've gotten to know about the Ahmadiyya movement a little bit, which I don't think is accepted as real Islam. But do any of those conflicts and divisions play out at all in the Muslimish community, or really, for that matter, in the greater Muslim community in the U.S.?
So in the Muslimish community, I mean, there are people that come from different backgrounds. So there are different people who are Shia and Sunnis. And so it's interesting, though, when we end up having discussions about things, because the Sunnis and Shias also have different, like hadith, sayings of the Prophet. So, and they have different some traditions. And so it's often interesting to have all of us together, because people from Shia will have a different perspective on a story than the Sunnis. So I guess in Muslimish it's sort of nice because it gives greater diversity to the historical and spiritual traditions in our discussions. In terms of the Muslim world, I don't know, I guess the one tidbit I can say is that because of all the wars now, the divisions are heightened. So like I had a roommate, she was from Syria, and her husband, now husband, is from Iraq. And they talked about how like if you go through different parts of Iraq, and if you're, say, Shia or Sunni, it doesn't matter, different parts are controlled by Sunnis or Shias. So if you're Shia going through the Sunni checkpoint, you could be killed just by being of the other sect. And the same thing happens in the reverse section. And so there's been a lot, I think in the Muslim world, what's probably happened now, I would say, is that these divisions have become just starker. And beforehand, no one really cared whether you were Sunni or Shia.
When I was in Portland, I got to know a lot of the Muslim community, and I just observed that they didn't really care if somebody was Shiite or Sunni.
No, in
But
America,
if it was Ahmadiyya, forget about it. They were not accepted.
yeah, in America it's different. Yeah, in America, like people are going to care less. But yeah, the Ahmadiyyas are considered apostates.
I have somewhat of a practical question. I'm curious, it's two parts. So personally for you, what does your family think of where you stand right now with your connection to and your relationship with Islam? And what goes along with that, the people we find in the Muslimish group, and I understand it's a diverse group, but are they there a lot of times because of family issues and a rejection by their family, or is it something else, as far as just the culture and the climate that we have in this country right now?
So you can say the last part. So it's because
The reason that people come to the Muslim
Okay.
group, do you find it's primarily due to family rejection by family, or is a bigger part of it just a kind of a fear and needing a safe space due to the climate in the country?
Yeah, I think that,
Yes.
so the group will vary. There'll be some people, so definitely some people who come to the group and they're like, oh my God, I've like screened someone who was like this. He was like, oh my God, I didn't think anyone else existed besides me, and I felt so alone with my family, and talking to them about it. And you definitely have people who have much more conservative. So there's a lot of people in the group, who come from very conservative backgrounds, where they can't really talk about this, or say their family has rejected them and they don't talk to their family. And so, the group in that case does offer a means. So this isn't true with me, but for some people, I know we've sat in discussions, we'll talk about how they were forced to get up. So there are 5 prayers in the day, and the first prayer is when the sun rises. And so if you're like really young, like 10, you might be made to get up to pray that way, and people talk about the ways that their parents made them get up, like throwing water on them or something like that. And so in that case, I think the group does offer a sense of support, being like, oh, you experienced the same thing that I did, and feeling that level of support. So I think there's definitely a faction that comes from that way. My family was fairly liberal. My dad's very practicing, so he prays 5 times a day. But he was always like, you should do what makes you sort of happy. And so for me, it was just more of, I mean, I identify a lot with the group and the other people in the group, but I never had those struggles. But I have a lot of interest in learning more, so I really enjoy learning the stories and stuff like that. And so I think there's a bunch of people who are more like me too, who didn't have these same struggles, but they do sort of identify with their Muslim background and are interested in being with other people who are also of Muslim backgrounds, but have a similar sort of religious or spiritual mindset. So I guess it's sort of diverse.
I have more of a comment than a question. Whenever people talk about religion or even a belief system or an organization, whether it's atheism, humanism, theism, Christianity, Jewish, Islam, any of those labels to me at this point are almost obstructions to really getting at to what the individual is, because there's so much diversity within each of those large labels. To even say, I'm Islamic, or I'm Christian, or I'm humanist, doesn't really tell the whole story, because each person's way of living that out is so unique to them. It's almost like the label is doing a disservice to your own integrity. I don't know.
But I guess for the Muslim world, I know someone had told this story at a podcast that we had where like that Muslim identity gave you strength. So when they grew up here in America, they felt sort of like an outsider. And so by praying and getting that label of being a Muslim, it sort of gave them some strength. So I agree with you. Like you lose some sense of individuality, and that's what Muslimish is about. Try to bring different people together and see that it's okay being different, and then we can exchange. But it seems like people value this label. They value the strength that comes from like simplifying.
Yeah, like, I mean, just to say, ask you directly, in what way are you Muslim if you're not worshiping the divine? Instead, have created this meditative mantra that to the black hole is making more sense to you, which I'm not denigrating or anything. I don't understand how that remains to be Muslim.
So which is why maybe the label Muslimish is sort of a useful label. Yeah, I know. I've sort of struggled with that too often. I'm like, because I feel sort of some draw for myself personally. You feel some draw to other people who are of Muslim backgrounds and from like the home country. So I'm from Pakistan. So other people who are from Pakistan. So you have some draw, and there's some traditions that are shared. But yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer. For me, that's the way I feel. There's always this tension then between the traditions that require certain things, and then, like you're mentioning, I was adapting it into a new way. And so it's hard for me to know myself. Am I no longer Muslim? Am I like...
Yeah, it's almost like you're finding more resonance in the ritual, cultural aspect than the idea of a greater being.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But that's tied pretty tightly, though. I guess that theistic sort of elements in Islam are tied very tightly to the religion.
Yeah.
So that's why I was talking about this no reform movement. So there's not this... So I think in Christianity, it seems like there's a continuum between different churches. And so I think maybe that's why it's tough for me dealing with this, because there is no real continuum that I can draw on. Oh, okay, yeah, there's secular humanists, and then after that, there's reform-minded, and there's other sorts of people. And so it makes it harder, I think, to grapple with, who you are, because there's this bigger chasm between the Muslim background and me. So, yeah, I think it's tough,
Before a lot of the wars in the Arab world, there were fairly large socialist movements, and that's how a lot of people were atheists. A lot of people who were in socialist movements were atheists. So, how did these atheists in the Arab world relate with, Islamists, especially since a lot of them were progressive and did progressive things, but being atheists, were they persecuted or reviled by I know the governments were repressive, but I'm just talking about the community. If somebody was a socialist atheist, how were they perceived by, let's say, an Islamist person? How did that work? And how is it today? Are there any socialists left in Arab countries that are atheists?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot to say, because there's a lot of history that's happened.
Sure.
So I think for atheism, like, say, I was mentioning the book Islamic Enlightenment, and it talks about the 1800s and the 1700s, and there are very progressive people, and it seems like they're basically atheists, but just like in the Western world, if you go back far enough in time, people seem like they're atheists, but they don't go out and say they're atheists because it's not a thing in society to be atheists. So that's the one thing. So in the Muslim world, atheism wasn't a thing, and so that's maybe one point to make. The second point is just there's been a lot of, so I showed the example of the hijab, the 1960s. So that's an example where most of the Muslim world is run by secular governments, and then there's been this shift, and so on lines of that, yes, there's I think been much stronger force against atheism. But again, it depends on which country you're from.
Even when they're socialists?
So
Because I mean, there are a lot of prominent, socialist intellectuals, Arab intellectuals.
yes, so there are, but you're generally not that vocal. Particularly as a group, you're not that vocal. So, so this is outside the scope of my expertise. But maybe give one example, like in Iran or like Saudi Arabia. If you're an atheist, you're actively like expunged from those societies. Like in Iran, after they had their revolutionary war, there's a lot of Iranians here now that were atheists and that had to leave. So now, if you're atheist in Iran,
Just for being atheist?
but not atheists, but they were progressives. They were against the new government. And so I think, this is going to be a generalization, but in the Muslim world, there seems to be this shift. Like in Iran, you can see it. In Turkey, you can see it now. Turkey was super secular. And so now it's gradually been shifted. And so now to be atheist would be a lot worse than, say, back in the early 1900s. So I think, and that's why I was tying it to this idea that, to me, it seems like it's a reflection of this Muslim identity. So it seems like the common people or the regular people want a strengthened Muslim identity. And that conflicts with being atheist or secular, which are seen to, this is my theory, is that it conflicts with it. And so I guess in answer to your question, so nowadays I think in Muslim countries it's pretty bad. Even if the governments don't condone it, like in Bangladesh you've probably heard a lot about the bloggers and stuff. So there the governments actually sort of wants to protect it. At least they say they want to protect them. But the people now are very much like against it. So there's now I think there's this other thing. It's not just about the governments, but like about the populace. So I think in most Muslim countries now, if you're atheist, it's probably, you might be a little bit afraid, not just from the governments, but from regular people, deeming you to be an apostate and taking the rules into their own hands.
That's a really interesting thread from your talk. And this identity thing is happening in many other contexts too. You see it happening with Putin in Russia. You see it happening with the white nationalism phenomenon in the United States. And it's kind of a backlash against globalism and all these other social changes that have been happening.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how it plays out too in the Muslim community. That was a fascinating part of your talk.
Yeah.
I think there are currently 13 countries, mostly Muslim countries, where atheism is an offense where it's punishable by death. Yeah, and in Bangladesh, it was the 2 atheist bloggers who were hacked to death, just a few years ago. So it's serious. I think a lot of, we live here and we don't realize just how serious it is and how frightening it must be.
Yeah, for some of those.
I guess it's seen as a huge threat. Atheism is seen as a huge threat, and maybe touching on this imperialism that you spoke of.
I think it's also, that's why I was saying it's also seen as a Western thing.
Yes.
I think there's a mix of that too.
Very
So atheism is already going against the group and your Western style thinking. So I think it's a double win.